Tales of Estolia. Written by Sashina Kerfman. Volume 1. The Promise of Zaccarias. Part 6. Prophecy. Chapter 1. Circus Freak. Los Angeles International Airport, 2022.
The quality of a woman's soul is reflected in the brilliance and colors of her aura. Deity promised, from the time of Zaccarias, that guidance would be provided to grant clarity to all of his descendants and confirm the suitability of their chosen mate. Alessandro Octavius Zaccarian, Capitulo 72.
Kenzie deftly slipped her shoes back on her feet, and then picked up her carry-on luggage. Pausing for a minute, she got oriented and then moved in the direction of the gate for her flight. She ignored the various looks being cast her way. She had grown used to the way people looked at her. She remembered what Mark said when he saw her.
"You look like a goddamn circus freak."
She focused in on the supercilious curl to his lip as he terminated their engagement and summed up everything she was lacking. He said,
"Mother Nature herself hates you. She even gave you 2 different colored eyes to prove it."
He went on to say that she was childish to have hair that went down to her waist. He added that the blubber at hip and bust, above and below her slender waist, made her look like a caricature of a woman. She was 6 feet tall, 2 inches taller than him.
A man wants to be needed. To feel as though his woman needs to be protected. He doesn't want a goddamn Amazon. A woman big enough to protect him instead. What man would look at you and think you're cuddly or attractive?
She arrived at her gate and found a convenient place to sit. She continued to remember that last conversation, especially the sneer on his face as he denounced her personality as too flamboyant, her intelligence as lacking, and her singing voice as too shrill. In all things, he summed her up as coarse, unattractive, lacking in proper femininity and, once a man got to know her, unworthy of marriage. Most of what he said did not bother her, but she had always felt too tall, too fat, and too strong a personality. She should have seen the writing on the wall once Mark met her cousin Sheila. Yet, for Kenzie, it was still a shock when he dumped her. When her best friend, Layla, begged her to take part in a before and after hairstyling and coloring competition, Kenzie agreed. By the end of the competition, her hair was a glorious rainbow, and her friend won the grand prize. The sponsors of the competition presented her with a half-dozen outfits, designed to mesh perfectly with her extraordinary coloring, and an all-expenses-paid week-long trip to Paris. And Mark used her new look as a reason to dump her. Kenzie shrugged off her memories and thought ahead to the new chapter in her life. With her new wardrobe and the 10-day vacation, she felt as though her future would hold some great new solo adventures. Mark's denouncement solidified her belief she was not marriage, or girlfriend, material. No, she thought to herself, she would not seek out romance in her future. There were plenty of things she could do in her life that did not include men. She would get a new job when she returned, possibly even move to a new city or a new state. For now, she was going to enjoy Paris. All other decisions would wait until she returned. There were still 2 hours before her international flight would begin boarding. Across the busy concourse was a lounge. She would get a drink. 10 minutes later she was standing next to the concourse sipping a rainbow concoction the bartender insisted she had to try. She idly watched the stream of humanity flowing back and forth in the busy airport. People were arriving from far distant places and heading either for the exits or for connecting flights. They were also arriving from the city to begin their adventures. Octogenarians and teenagers, women with babies, affluence and poverty, businessmen, newlyweds, solo flyers and large families, pilots and flight attendants, airport workers. Humanity in all its raw sizes, shapes, and situations. She amused herself by speculating on the lives of the people she saw, especially the men. One man had a roll of fat like a spare tire around his middle, almost perfectly emulated by the brown fringe of hair around a shiny bald head. His face seemed to settle naturally into smile lines. She imagined that he was a father of 3, with a little 8-year-old daughter grinning adoringly at him with one tooth missing. His wife would be sort of dull and uninspiring to others, but he would not see that. He would see her as beautiful and desirable. Kenzie turned her attention to another man who was probably in his mid to late 50s. His tank top showed off a long expanse of skinny, sinewy tattooed arms, and parts of his tattooed torso. His hair fell to below his shoulders and was lank and greasy, dark brown with more white and grey than the original color. She imagined him going to head-banging rock concerts in his younger years, and waiting for his music career ship to come sailing in and bring him glory, riches, and women, only to have it sail right by the pier of life upon which he was standing. A slender man with receding red hair and lots of freckles looked around like he was lost until a musical shout caught his attention. Before Kenzie could dream of what his life was like, a small blonde woman raced up to him and kissed him, oblivious of where they stood in the airport. With a blush, Kenzie turned her attention away from the couple. She wished some man would care for her as much as the redhead seemed to care for the petite blonde woman. The next person she noticed was a man in a business suit, a high-powered executive, she decided, coat slung over one shoulder, briefcase in his hand, walking slowly towards where she was standing, his thoughts clearly centered inward. He was looking directly at her but did not seem to see her. She decided that his thoughts were troubling him. He probably had some critical business decision he was faced with, and did not know whether he should make a leap of faith or do something conservative instead. He had very dark hair, dark eyes, and she thought he would sport dimples if he ever bothered to smile. He looked like he was in his late 20s or early 30s, tall, well over 6 feet, with very broad shoulders, slender hips, large elegant hands, and overall the sort of build Kenzie found attractive. Mark had a similar build, but compared to this man, Mark fell far short of her ideal. This man was her ideal. For just a moment, she had an erotic image of him in bed with her, their limbs intimately tangled, their bodies joined, and she had to look away with a slight blush. She glanced at her drink and sipped some more of the concoction. It was as good as the bartender promised, and it matched her hair and her dress. She smiled whimsically at her thoughts and looked up, ready to continue her people watching. Except now, standing in front of her, was the sexy man she had fantasized about. He did have dimples.
Hello,
He said to her. He took in her entire appearance, from her shoes to the curtain of rainbow-colored hair before his eyes met hers.
I saw you from a distance and I thought to myself that I have never seen a more incredible-looking woman in my life.
He spoke with a rich accent and sexy voice. After Mark's denunciation of her, the stranger's words were a balm for her injured soul. She grinned and returned the compliment.
Thank you, you're pretty incredible looking yourself.
He laughed. The sound trickled down her spine and lodged in her core.
Do you mind if I have a drink here with you? It is some time before my flight, and I should enjoy having the chance to relax for a moment with a beautiful woman.
She shrugged in acquiescence. 5 minutes later he was back with a drink, asking if she would sit inside the establishment, instead of sitting on the edge of the concourse. She followed him to an isolated booth. He sat across from her and smiled at her again.
My name is Nicodemus Luciano Zaccarias. Please call me Nico.
She smiled and offered.
I'm Kenzie O'Rourke.
She felt a thrill to have this handsome man spending time with her, even though they were just two strangers who would never meet again.
It is a true delight to meet you. Tell me a little about you, Kenzie. It is obvious that you have a fascinating story.
His eyes lifted to the rainbow blast of color that was her hair. She had to laugh at that.
I'm not really.
She demurred. When he just waited, she said.
I'm 22, single, on my way to France for a vacation with only myself as company. I'm between jobs, and when I return I'll look for another job. I might move someplace else and find a job there. I work in customer support.
Is there not some extraordinary story about your marvelous look?
She shared with him the contest she volunteered for and how hers became the winning hairstyle, resulting in the vacation to Paris.
Have you recently divorced?
He touched the circle of lighter skin on her left ring finger. She frowned at her hand, at where he was rubbing the lighter skin with his thumb.
No, my fiancé decided I looked like a fat circus freak, and he traded me in for someone better looking.
A man singularly lacking in taste to so malign a woman as incredibly beautiful as you.
He raised her left hand to his mouth so he could kiss the circle of lighter skin. Chapter 2. Questions.
The sons of Zaccarias will encounter the woman who will keep their soul in the most unlikely of places. The key ingredient that must always be at the forefront of their mind is that when deity provides the aura, they must be willing to see and act upon it. Jonathan Tethys Zaccarian, Capitulo 83.
The waitress paused by them and asked if they wanted another drink, or something to eat. Her companion ordered another of the rainbow drinks for her and a drink for himself. He was charming and personable to the waitress, and Kenzie's opinion of him went up. She was always impressed by people who could treat those in the service industry with respect and dignity.
So tell me about you, Nico.
She invited him.
I am from the island nation of Estolia. I am returning to my land to be married. It is a family and religious obligation to marry during my 30th year. I will be 30 at the end of the week, so I must needs fulfill my destiny and marry.
Your bride-to-be is waiting for your return then?
She asked. She felt a little let down to discover this man, who was so flirtatious with her, was already taken.
No, indeed. When I began this journey, I had not yet met the woman who could keep my soul safe. I simply knew that the sooner I could find the woman who would fulfill my needs, the happier I would be.
His expression grew intense.
May I ask you 2 questions, Kenzie? Will you promise to answer them truthfully?
She nodded and took a long sip of her fresh rainbow-colored drink.
I found myself wondering, the instant I saw you, if my first overwhelming impression of you could possibly be correct.
His eyes searched hers, as if seeking answers in their multicolored depths.
From the moment the thought came to me, I knew it was essential I determine if it was true. It seemed unlikely, in this era, in your country, for a woman of such exceptional beauty, such exquisite presence to be untouched. And yet, Kenzie, that was the thought that came to me when first I saw you. Will you confirm that you are, in fact, untouched?
Kenzie felt a flood of warmth rise to her face. She was not sure if he was asking what she thought he was. After a second, when he continued to wait, she sought clarification.
You're asking if I'm a virgin?
He nodded and waited. She remembered Mark's words on the topic, how men did not want all the tears, blood, and inexperience of a virgin in their bed. Lifting her chin, she admitted.
I am. Do you make it a hobby to go around trying to figure out whether women have had sex?
He shook his head in response to her question.
In truth, I have never once actively entertained such a curiosity about a woman before now. I felt it was something I had to know about you.
Why? We're strangers. In an hour I'm getting on an airplane headed for France.
I suppose the main reason was that if you were, as I suspected, untouched, then I would be able to ask you my second question.
She took another long drink of her rainbow beverage before asking.
And what is your second question?
He reached across the table to grasp both of her hands and locked his eyes with hers, before asking.
Will you marry me?
She was left speechless. Here was a man who was an 11 on the Richter scale of male good looks somehow asking her to marry him.
You're serious?
Never more so. I knew from the moment I saw you that you were the one woman on this planet I could marry. Once I recognized you as the woman destined to keep my soul, I was faced with the task of somehow convincing you it was true.
She should be telling this man she could not possibly marry him. But there was something compelling about him, alluring. She had the strongest urge to just tell him she would marry him, on the strength of that one question.
I'm intrigued. How could you convince me?
I believe if you saw my homeland, you might be more easily convinced. Would you be willing to accompany me to Estolia? It is a beautiful land. We do not allow tourists, but it is a rich nation, and every invited visitor we have ever had has told us how fine and inspiring our land is. I could give you a most delightful vacation, treat you like a princess, and you could decide there.
My mother taught me to not take rides or candy from strangers. I'm not sure it would be wise to just allow you to take me to your homeland.
Alternatively, I could follow you to France, court you, seduce you, and thereby convince you.
His voice was low and sexy, and when he spoke about seduction, she felt he was already seducing her nerve endings into compliance.
I don't know why I'm tempted to accept your proposal,
Kenzie said, feeling as though the mental clarity she normally enjoyed was missing. She glanced at her drink. 2 tall exotic alcoholic beverages were lightly chiseling away at her inhibitions.
What would you do if that didn't work?
I could simply abduct you, bring you to Estolia, seduce, entice, and ensnare you.
I should say no, it's crazy. How do I know I can trust you? You've admitted to plans to seduce me or abduct me.
Tell me, Kenzie O'Rourke, what enticement might find favor with you? How might I convince you to at least explore the possibility? I firmly believe that if you came to Estolia, you would discover my proposal meets with your favor. So if I cannot entice you to agree to marry me, can I entice you to travel with me to Estolia?
The more he spoke, the more tempted she was.
I have a ticket to France. I do not have a ticket to Estolia. Even if you could buy me a last-minute ticket to Estolia, what if I choose not to marry you? I'd be giving up my all-expenses-paid trip to France.
I have an acceptable solution. Allow me to convert your ticket to an open-date ticket in first class. You will be able to request travel on any date via Estolia Airlines. This will clear up the airfare. I am certain your hotel accommodations can be likewise shifted. If they cannot, I shall supply new ones for you.
My luggage! I can't do without my luggage, and it's going to France.
Earlier she explained to him her wonderful wardrobe that was created specifically to look good with her hair. He chuckled.
So will you accompany me to Estolia if I can miraculously acquire your luggage?
You haven't addressed the one other thing I mentioned. How do you know I can get tickets to Estolia?
That, my dear, is the easiest of all hurdles. If you will give me your tickets, your hotel information, and your claim tickets for your luggage, I will return within 15 minutes with new tickets to Estolia.
She handed over the requested items and watched him leave, wondering if she was crazy to just hand over her tickets to this handsome man who proposed within an hour of meeting her. She sat back in her seat and closed her eyes, trying to keep thoughts of the handsome man out of her mind. She kept imagining his body entwined with hers in the most erotic positions. After a minute, she decided to use her smartphone to look up his country. She had never heard of it. The information available online was minimal, barely 1 page.
Estolia, one of the Balearic Islands situated between Mallorca and Ibiza in the western Mediterranean Sea, southeast of Spain, sometimes referred to as Pequeño. 2020 census data puts the population at 13,293. Founded in the year 720 BCE by the prophet Zaccarias and his wife Estoliana. They established both the nation and a religion at the same time. The nation has a hereditary monarchy but is primarily a theocracy. The current monarch is Leonidas Agamemnon Zaccarian. In the Estolian religion, men are constrained to marry at the age of 30, and there are restrictions as to whom they can marry. All marriages must be approved by the leader of the religion, usually the younger brother of the king. Desiree Andorra of Barcelona won the gold medal in dressage in the 2020 Tokyo Olympic Games. Her horse, Cimitarra de España, is an Andestolian warmblood. These talented horses originate in northern Estolia. The Walled Swan is indigenous to the Balearic Islands, but can now only be found in Estolia. Tourists are not accepted. Travel visas are strictly limited.
Chapter 3: Persuasion.
I do not think that deity can, as a celestial being, understand the gift that was given to each of the sons of Zaccarias. In most things, the man protects his wife, provides for her without thinking, and yet she is given the most precious of cargo to nurture and protect the soul of a man. I would argue that all Estolian boys, as a product of the woman who keeps their father's soul, are irretrievably altered even before birth, predisposed to yearn to have their soul kept for them. Samuel Amador, Musings on Estolian Physiology.
Kenzie stared at the picture of the king that accompanied the short article on Estolia. He was very similar in looks to Nico, perhaps a couple of years older, and not nearly as handsome. She tried to look up further information, but got the same few paragraphs on multiple websites. She had never heard of any country having so little information available on the internet.
I was able to finish the tasks you set me in under 10 minutes.
Nico said, sliding back into the booth, breathing heavily as if he had been running.
I could not, however, bring your suitcases into this region of the airport, as they do not allow this due to security screening. I promise to demonstrate to you my success prior to boarding, so you will have no doubts.
You were able to get my luggage? What about the hotel, the airplane tickets?
He smiled, his dimples showing again.
I must confess that I decided my true quest to win your agreement to visit my nation was to find your luggage. I was able to do that easier than I anticipated. I shall simply pay for hotel accommodations in Paris if you do not choose to remain with me in Estolia, and the airplane tickets were easiest of all, as I merely had to secure tickets on Estolia Airlines.
How will I obtain a travel visa? Google says they are strictly limited.
She was going to do this crazy thing and go with this stranger to the land of Estolia.
I have not mentioned that my father and uncle are men of some importance in Estolia. I, too, have a position of some power. I am the one who issues travel visas. It is easy for me to invite anyone I wish to come to Estolia.
And the next flight to Estolia?
They are ready for boarding, even at this very moment.
He slid out of the booth and extended a hand to her. She put her hand in his, and allowed him to pull her to her feet. Was she crazy to go with this man? While they walked, she mentally reviewed the information she got from her internet search.
The internet says all marriages must be approved by the religious leader of your nation.
She stopped abruptly before pointing out what, to her, seemed to be an important consideration.
I can't imagine them accepting someone who looks like a circus freak.
He stopped when she did, and at her reference, he looked at her, his eyes traveling over her colorful hair and mismatched eyes. He shook his head slightly and said,
I believe you will find favor with the leader of the Estolian religion.
This is crazy.
She said. Her eyes met his.
I don't know anything about you.
But you are tempted. That means it is right that we marry.
He put his hands on her shoulders and leaned forward to kiss her lightly. The kiss was reassuring with a hint of future passion. When he pulled back, he smiled into her eyes before heading for their gate. She followed him without question. 15 minutes later, they were at a little used gate where a woman in a fancy uniform of green and purple stood next to the open door, waiting. She smiled at them both.
We are ready to board.
Her attention turned to Kenzie, and she said to her,
We were able to retrieve your luggage from the Air France flight. It is on the tarmac awaiting your inspection before we stow it properly.
Kenzie followed Nico down a ramp and out a door. Her suitcases were standing on the tarmac near a small private jet. She opened one, and saw the familiar items she had packed. She stood up straight again, and looked from Nico to the air stairs. If she chose to follow him onto the waiting airplane, she sensed that he wouldn't be satisfied if she decided later on that she wouldn't marry him. Was she becoming complicit in her own abduction?
I'm caught up in this web, so fragile. Don't know which way to go. Can't find my my style, my heart's a jigsaw puzzle.
Nico stared at her. Kenzie O'Rourke. He could barely recall what it was like to not know her. One idle glance and it was as if he'd been blindsided. She was at the center of a vortex, a pulsing rainbow tornado of sensations and feelings. The moment was indelibly imprinted on his memory, the moment his soul encountered its future home. He shook off the memory and focused on her. She looked uncertain. He needed to convince her to board the airplane. He closed the distance between them, pulling her slowly into his arms so he could kiss her again. He put his body, self, and soul into using the kiss to convince her to accompany him. When he pulled away, she looked bemused. He settled her arm beneath his own and led her up the stairs and into the airplane.
It'll find its reasons. Tangled
Chapter 4. Abduction.
trapped in the night.
Throughout Estolian history, there have been times when the heir apparent has abducted his future Kaylee when faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Abduction was the most common method whereby the woman in question was brought to Estolia's fair shores. On the face of it, one might consider this practice as abhorrent as many other atrocities throughout history. However, each woman who has been abducted is given a choice. No woman can be forced to remain in Estolia or with a specific man against their will. It is utterly impossible. Any woman kept under duress could quite easily withhold their approval of the union, and the man so rejected would waste away until death is a welcome release from the torment of our waking world. This is the central element to our marriage ceremony. Addio of Marriage, Preface.
She looked around curiously. It did not look like any airline she had ever frequented. The padded seats and other furniture looked more like luxury furnishings in a living room. There were no other passengers.
I thought you said they began boarding already.
They were ready to have us board. Estolian Airlines is a convenient name for the small fleet of private jets used by the government of Estolia for matters of state.
The door to the jet was secured and it began to back up. She was kept from asking the next question dancing in her mind by an announcement over the intercom.
Molimo zakopčajte sigurnosne pojaseve. Kad poletimo, poslužit ćemo osvježenje, a nešto kasnije ćemo pojesti obrok.
She listened in fascination to the lyrical foreign language, the fluid symmetry of consonants and vowels, and the inflections on different syllables. She recognized the influence of the language on Nico's exquisite accent. Once the announcement was over, Nico said,
I have been informed we will be stopping twice to refuel, but it is anticipated we will land before dawn in Estolia.
Have you abducted me?
She blurted out.
That is an interesting question, mostly because the answer is not clear. I could answer your question with perfect honesty by saying you have not been abducted, but I could also say I have abducted you.
Before she could respond to that strange statement, the intercom came alive again, this time in English.
We are next in line for takeoff. Please buckle your seatbelts. Once airborne, we will be serving refreshments, and a little later, we will have a meal. Flying time to Estolia is approximately 11 hours, with an anticipated arrival to coincide with sunrise at the Amador Airport.
Echoes of promises that now bring me pain.
Shortly after the announcement, the airplane took off. Kenzie looked at Nico, seeing pleasure and satisfaction on his face. She sensed that this was his short-term objective, to have her completely within his power. Once the airplane was no longer climbing, she was served a glass of wine. Only then did she have the chance to question Nico's assertion.
In what way have I not been abducted?
He sipped at his golden wine and seemed to be considering his answer.
When you were given the courtesy of an invitation that you chose to accept, and you came aboard of your own free will, you could hardly be considered the victim of abduction. In addition, there are no shackles that hold you captive. Nobody will make you do anything you sincerely object to doing. You will not come to any harm while on this airplane or within my country. You will be an honored guest at all times.
While he spoke, his eyes met hers and delivered an equivalent message of sincerity. She sensed some undercurrents, but she believed she was safe.
If all that is true, then how have you abducted me?
If I wish it, I could keep you in Estolia indefinitely.
And is that your wish, Nico, to keep me indefinitely?
Kenzie O'Rourke, you knew before you came aboard this airplane that I want the chance to convince you to marry me. It is my hope that you will marry me and remain with me forever in Estolia.
Their conversation became more general after that when they were brought a meal. Shortly afterwards, the 2 rainbow drinks, along with 3 glasses of wine, had Kenzie drifting off to sleep. Nico thought about his brother. Leon was behind him fully in his semi-abduction of the colorful woman. He had no doubt that she would marry him. It would be impossible for the future keeper to meet the woman who was meant to keep his soul and have her reject him. No. Fate, the promise of Zaccarias, and pure chemistry dictated that this woman was the one woman who would keep his soul, complete him, and hand to him the final mantle of power that he could not obtain without her. In his case, becoming the last resort was only a matter of helping Leon find Callista Tyr, and then making sure his brother fulfilled Estolian law by wedding her no more than 7 days after bedding her. Nico would gratefully retire the sash of office to its normal location in the Mount Estoliana temple, once his firstborn child received his birth blessing. It would adorn the statue of Zaccarias in his office until a year before Leon's son, Tiernan, turned 30. What would he learn in the days ahead about this woman who called herself a fat circus freak? His heart flipped when he saw the circle of untanned flesh on her left ring finger. Could the aura be mistaken? Had some other man deprived him of his Kaylee? Uncle Zeke would be surprised by how flamboyant this woman was. Certainly, she was nothing like the women he dated in college. Yes, Kenzie would surprise his relatives. But appearances were unimportant when compared to the character and soul within, and on that score, he had no doubts about her. He felt the subtle push from deity, and knew that Kenzie would never be his if he seduced her without telling her everything she needed to know beforehand. He could never take any woman without consent, but just having her agree to intimacy was not enough. She had to know what she was agreeing to. Her recent breakup left her soul slightly bruised, but he had no doubts that she was a strong woman, with a powerful sense of self. No, as keeper, his Kaylee needed to understand who she was marrying. He had a week to acquaint her with the most important aspects of Estolian religion, custom, and law. A week to gain her heart. A week before he would claim everything that she was, inside and out. A week before the most pivotal moment of his life, when his soul would find its home, where it would forever be comforted, cared for, and kept securely. The blessings bestowed upon his people, when they were willing to keep the promise of Zaccarias, were impossible to enumerate. He looked at Kenzie. He had absolutely no doubts about her. He hoped he would be able to convince her as soon as possible. She might not have really understood what he meant when they joked about abduction, but he was determined that she would never leave Estolia except by his side, as his wife. Chapter 5, Rainbow Dawn.
The hardest part of being a daughter of Estolia in the modern world is in accepting the patrilineal model of succession and the misconception that women are somehow lesser in this model of government and religion. Once I took the soul of my husband into my keeping, I realized that the opposite was true. If anything, women are given more control over our world than the men. We keep their soul and influence their actions from the age of 30 onward. Rhiannon Zaccarian, Enscrito.
Kenzie felt a waft of fresh sweet-smelling air on her face and opened her eyes. Sitting up, she saw the airplane was on the ground, and the door into the jet was open. Through the windows and through the open door she saw that the sky was a subdued rainbow of colors, from deep indigo night all the way to an incandescent yellow-white near the eastern horizon. Nico changed while she was asleep. He looked like a prince. His outfit was crisp and almost military in its precision. He had white gloves on and what seemed to be a ceremonial sword strapped to his side. He had shaved and looked refreshed. He even had a slender but unmistakable crown on his head.
You are awake, Kenzie. Good, we have arrived in Estolia. If you will follow Loretta, she will show you where you can refresh your appearance.
15 minutes later, Kenzie was wearing another of the outfits she was given as part of the contest. It was a bold rainbow color. The bodice was a creamy pale yellow in almost a peasant style, with a low neckline showing off plenty of cleavage. The skirt was the whimsical feature. There was a mid-thigh length underskirt in the same color as the bodice. She felt like it gave her the appearance of walking in a rainbow-colored seafoam froth. When she joined Nico, she knew she was looking her best.
I believe no Estolian has ever brought home a bride as exquisite as you.
She looked at him sharply and said,
I haven't promised you, Nico.
She knew when she said it that it was not true. They both knew she was probably going to marry him, but she did not want him to make assumptions. He inclined his head before saying,
Welcome to Estolia. I hope your promise will brighten both of our futures, when you are willing to give it.
At the top of the stairs leading out of the jet, she paused to look at Estolia. The sun had not yet crept over the edge of the world, but the sky was more brilliant than before. At the base of the stairs were 3 men dressed very formally. Behind them were several carriages. 2 were open-topped, each pulled by a set of 4 identical horses. 1 set were white, and the other were brown. A third carriage was more substantial in a different style, pulled by the type of horses from beer commercials. They descended the stairs together, and when they reached the pavement the sun spilled over the horizon, bringing the world of Estolia into brilliant life. The 3 men who were there to meet them were impressive. One man, a few years older than Nico, was familiar to her. His picture had been on the internet. He dressed fancier than Nico, with a thick crown on his head. Seeing him in person like this made it obvious that Nico must be related to him. The other 2 men were around the age of 60. One wore a sort of monk's robe in rich purple and green. He looked like he was related to both younger men. He had a goatee and looked very sharp, very intelligent. The third man wore a slender crown, and his clothing was similar to that worn by the 2 younger men, with a cape and sword. All 4 men wore, like an invisible cloak, a sort of ultimate confidence, like they knew their place in the world and the world knew them. Nico halted next to the youngest man, and bent at the waist briefly before turning to her.
Kenzie, this is my brother, Leonidas Agamemnon Zaccarian, Duke, Sovereign, and King of Estolia. Leon, this is Kenzie O'Rourke, the woman I hope will consent to keep my soul.
He said he had relatives in high places, so Kenzie should not have been surprised by the revelation that his brother was the king. She had no idea how to properly greet a king. He solved her difficulty by pulling her into his arms in a solid hug.
Kenzie, you are welcome here in Estolia. Please call me Leon.
His arm around her shoulders, the king turned to the other man wearing a crown and said,
This is our father, Isaiah Monterey Zaccarian, King Emeritus, and my 3rd consul. Father, this is Kenzie O'Rourke, the woman destined to keep Nico's soul.
She got another hug from the former king.
Kenzie, I can see you are truly a special woman. It is my hope that you will choose to bring my son the happiness he deserves.
His voice was gruff. Nico grabbed her hand and pulled her over to the man with the goatee.
Kenzie, this is Lazarus Ezekiel Zaccarian. He is the current keeper of the soul of Estolia, former 1st consul and former last resort. He goes by the name Zeke. Uncle, may I present Kenzie O'Rourke? By the light of her aura, I knew she was the one who could keep my soul.
He stepped towards her and took both of her hands in his, looking at her intently. She had the strange sense that he was looking into her soul.
Kenzie, it is more of an honor than you can possibly guess for the 3 of us to meet you here this morning.
His eyes flicked to Nico before returning to her.
I see my nephew has selected a woman with a rare and extraordinary strength of will. I have only ever known one other woman with a similar strength, and she it is who keeps my own soul safe and dear. My nephew has probably not had the time to share with you much about himself. He is a humble man, He is also first consul to the king. I can say now he has chosen wisely. You are worthy to keep his soul. You have the sanction of the church.
Kenzie did not know what to say to these men. All three seemed to accept her despite her crazy circus freak hair and clothing. Chapter 6: Nuances.
From the time of Shania, it has become clear that the role of Kaylee to the keeper is the most critical. When Shania and Liarana came to Estolia, they were quite literally as different as night and day. Prior to their arrival, Shania was a slave with few rights, and Liarana saw nothing wrong in asking for a slave for her birthday. It was only later that she realized how fundamentally wrong it was. Once those two were wed to Tremaine and Antiochus, it was quite clear that there were significant differences that went deeper than the color of their skin. Shania was petite, but packed into that small frame was a dynamo of energy and intelligence. Tremaine was one of the most powerful keepers, but the records indicate that his strength was bolstered by his extraordinary Kaylee. She dedicated her life to her husband and the faith in a way that previous keepers, even Amador, did not quite embrace. Except for those times when motherhood kept her away, she was always with her husband in the temple. Most of the traditions surrounding the acolyte and elder years of study were solidified during their tenure. She wrote nearly as much as Tremaine and Antiochus combined. Her inscrito was later made into an audio that was designed for the Kaylee of the keeper. Meredith Zaccarian, History of Estolia, Special Edition.
Nico led her to the carriage with the brown horses. Once she was comfortably settled, he sat across from her.
What did your uncle mean when he said you are the first consul?
She asked. He looked more relaxed, more handsome than ever.
It is traditional for the firstborn son of the king to become the next king. The second son of the king has, in many ways, the position or positions of most authority in Estolia. I would not want to be king, and he would not want my position.
He paused for a moment to take a deep breath and smiled broadly.
It is great to be home again. When my brother was ready to turn 30, when it was time for him to marry, I took my first of 3 separate roles, the last resort. If he was unwilling to fulfill his duties to become king, then as a last resort, I would be the new heir apparent. To eliminate the possibility, I made certain he met and married the perfect woman.
When he seemed disinclined to continue, she prompted.
And first consul?
I was getting to that. The way succession works here in Estolia, when the heir's wife has her first son, 7 days later, the heir is coronated. Once he becomes king, the first consul steps down and the king's younger brother takes his place. It means that if something happens to him, I become king. When important decisions must be made, I am the first one he goes to for advice and counsel, though often he seeks simultaneously the counsel of our father and our uncle. We are called the Strellaran of Estolia, the 4 most powerful men in the nation.
Your uncle sounded like he was also speaking for the church.
She pointed out.
Being second in line to the throne and counselor to the king would not place my power above that of my brother. I have a third role I will take on when I marry, keeper of the soul of Estolia. This means I will take over and run the Church of Estolia as the spiritual leader. I cannot do this if I have not first given my own soul into the keeping of my wife.
This whole keeping of the soul stuff sounds weird.
Our faith revolves around several ideas unknown in any other religion. We believe a man is compelled to set aside all women but one once he turns 30. Then he must find a woman who is pure and untouched, a virgin, and have an exchange of like value with her. If he takes her purity, he takes from her something of great value, and he must give her something comparable in return, his soul. When he gives her his soul, she becomes his Kaylee, the keeper of his soul. Once he has found his Kaylee, a man cannot find sexual desire or pleasure in any other woman. Deity takes a strong hand and guides us to the right woman, guards us from making wrong choices, and for our willingness to yield up our lives and futures to these beliefs, we are provided great rewards far beyond anything those who are not Estolian will ever experience.
She remained silent, absorbing everything he said.
It is not typical to share so deeply the nuances of our faith.
Nico said solemnly.
As the future leader of the Estolian faith, I am the one who acts for the spiritual good of the nation. I did not propose to you lightly, Kenzie O'Rourke. I knew you were the right person to keep my soul, that you would be acceptable to the church, and that your unique presence would provide something my nation needed.
Before she could respond, the carriage came to a halt and she looked up. She had been so intent on their conversation that she was unaware of the scenery outside the carriage. She was enchanted to see that they were in front of a fairy tale palace on one side, and on the other was a huge pond with a fountain. They were next to a grand staircase with a mirror image set of dual steps leading up 3 floors to a grand entrance. She beamed a smile at Nico, glad she made the journey.
We are on Mount Zaccarias, and this is our palace. It is the seat of our government. I grew up here and think of it as the family home. I forget how awesome it is until I can see it through the eyes of some visitor. If you consent to marry me, we will continue to live here in the quarters set aside for the next keeper of the soul of Estolia.
He climbed out of the carriage and guided her over to the fountain, walking with her away from the palace and towards the edge of the drop-off. Once they could see down into the narrow valley, he pointed to the mountain on the other side of the alley.
That is Mount Estoliana.
He gestured to an ornate building near the base.
That is our cathedral, used for gatherings, meetings, celebrations, and ceremonies.
Kenzie was impressed by the cathedral. Just beyond it, she could see an elaborate entrance worked into the face of the mountain itself, with enormous cat statues on either side.
Is that some kind of tomb?
She asked. Nico's arm came around her shoulders and he pulled her closer.
That is our most sacred building, our temple. It is built into the base of the mountain. That is where I will spend most of my working time.
She looked from the mountain back to the man who brought her here. Her eyes searched his, trying to see her pathway forward. She knew, as she looked at him, that she could not say no. She wanted him, even if it was crazy to meet someone and immediately imagine and crave intimacy. She doubted, if all he said was true, that he would allow her to say no. She took a step closer to him and put her palm on his chest. No matter how calmly he spoke of his religion, keeping of souls, palaces and temples, his heart was beating rapidly. Whatever he saw in her eyes seemed to communicate something. He leaned forward and kissed her, pulling her body closer to his. She could feel his desire and knew it matched her own. When he finally brought the kiss to an end, he hugged her and said,
I believe you will find great happiness here in Estolia.
Chapter 7, Reflections.
When I was summoned to the hospital wing of the palace for a birth, I was not surprised. The hospital and maternity wings of the palace were 2 places in need of spiritual guidance. Guiding individuals into this life, and sometimes out of it, was one of the primary functions I held. I was struck forcefully once I arrived that something critical to our future was going to take place. The Amador triplets, as they unfortunately became known, were going to present ongoing challenges within the framework of Estolian society. As with all things, I immediately sought the guidance of the Spirit. Lazarus Ezekiel Zaccarian, Capitulo 88.
Nico lay on his bed in his room, staring at the mural on the ceiling. His mother and sister-in-law took Kenzie under their wing after they arrived. If he had been of any other calling, he likely would be regretting not following her to France and seducing her there. Now that he had been given official sanction, and now that she had told him, non-verbally at least, that she was going to marry him, he would be kept away from her until the night before his birthday. The thought of the sweet seduction on that night heated his blood. He rejected the notion of anything sweet or seductive. He had a feeling they would ravish one another. She struck sparks off him in ways he had never read about or spoke about with his father, uncle, or brother. Kenzie O'Rourke was a passionate, vibrant force to be reckoned with, and he looked forward to the reckoning. Oh yes, he looked forward to the moment when her soul would envelope his. A light tap on his door preceded it opening. He looked over and saw his brother coming into the bedroom.
Your Kenzie is amazing,
Leon said, laughing.
You might have warned us, though.
Nico laughed with his brother. He had known that the flamboyance of his choice would bemuse his family.
Deity had a hand in choosing her.
He reminded his brother.
Certainly true, brother, certainly true.
His face took on the familiar look of remembering that so frequently fascinated Nico. All the men had it, once they were solidly wed.
How are Callista and Tiernan?
Leon sat in one of the chairs by the bed and leaned back, a bright smile on his face.
Tiernan is doing very well. Callista is enjoying motherhood. I believe we might try to provide your son a playmate of the same age.
A true hardship,
Nico said dryly.
Callista likes your Kenzie. I think she will appreciate having someone else closer to her age to keep her company.
I thought Ria just moved back to Estolia.
Nico said, thinking of one of the reasons he journeyed to California in the first place.
You are right, of course, and liar. She and Max are also staying at least a year. Callista will have plenty of company, as will your Kenzie.
Kenzie. Every conversation drifted back to the woman who would keep his soul. Nico closed his eyes to savor the visual memory of Kenzie standing surrounded by the pulsating glow of her aura. Kenzie was grateful for the chance to be by herself. She would join the family for the midday meal in a few hours. It was important to take some time to absorb the impact of the last 24 hours. She sat in front of an ornate vanity mirror and brushed her hair, while she pondered her impressions of all that took place since she participated in the contest with her friend. When she first started to date him, Mark was proud of how important faithfulness was to him. He wanted to impress her, have her see how close he was to her idea of the perfect man. One of the things that hurt the most, once she realized that he was spending time with Sheila, was that his protestations of faithfulness were without substance. Once he found someone shorter, thinner, and prettier than Kenzie, he ignored everything he ever said about being faithful. When they had their big showdown, she pointed out his hypocrisy. His response still hurt. He blamed her lack of allure.
What the hell did you expect?
By the time he was done denouncing her character, appeal and femininity, she had grave doubts she could keep the attention of any man for an extended period. Nico might be attracted to her now, but she knew from experience that it could, probably would, wear off. If she could believe Nico, adultery was unknown here in Estolia. Faithfulness was built into the religion. But was it true? She set the brush down on the vanity table and looked at her reflection. If she could just believe everything he told her about his faith, she would marry him and remain in his country. She looked at her rainbow reflection and grinned, feeling a sudden lightness of spirit. She wanted to marry the marvelous man she had fallen in love with. Her skin prickled. Had she really fallen in love with Nico? She barely knew him. When she first saw him, she recognized him as a man with great personal power and, within moments of seeing him, imagined herself intimately entwined with him. Even after she and Mark got engaged, she never imagined intimacy with him. Not like Nico, who had the ability to energize her imagination. If she was honest with herself, he did more than that. Nico walked into her life and tilted it on its axis. He enticed her with his accent, dazzled her with his dimples, and captured her with his charm. If what she was feeling was not love, then she did not know what was. Because for certain, her emotions were more involved with Nico after 24 hours than they were with Mark, after knowing him almost 18 months. Chapter 8. Decisions.
Deity chose the Estolian people to bestow great blessings upon, but like day follows night, all things have their price. And the price for our great blessing, as a people, is to keep the promise Zaccarias made to Deity. Antonio Seton, Capitulo 35.
A discreet tap on her door roused her out of her thoughts, and she rose and went to open the door. It opened before she got to it. It was Nico's uncle, Zeke. He asked,
"Do you mind if I come in, my dear?"
She stepped backwards, allowing him to enter. They walked over to the small arrangement of chairs.
I sensed your need to have a few more questions answered.
He said.
I do.
She admitted.
Nico said it was not typical to be so forthright about your religion, but it is a little bit different in a situation like this.
Nico's future was set before he was born, before his parents married. He was always destined to be the man to take my position in the fullness of time. It is not, however, an easy job he will be taking on. Keeping the soul of Estolia requires a strength of character, not only in the man who becomes keeper, but also in his spouse. We believe that Deity, our God, has a way of guiding the keeper to the one woman best qualified for the role. When he finds her, he will know it because he sees her aura.
She wondered if she would ever get the nuances of this faith straight.
Nico was walking in the airport and he saw my aura, and that was it. He was stuck with me, even though he didn't speak with me before he saw it.
We have been a successful nation because of our great faith in the promise our founder, Zaccarias, made to Deity, and in the promises that Deity made to him.
From what Nico told me, he makes it sound like being unfaithful is either impossible or at least uncommon. That sounds too good to be true.
He shared.
Estolians are not perfect. There have been a few limited situations where a couple have stepped outside the acceptable boundaries of marital relationships. In each case, they have opted to tie themselves to one another before that time dictated by Deity and without the sanction of the Church. In so doing, they nullify the promised blessings and constraints. In general, those couples choose to depart from Estolia's shores. We help them establish themselves in the greater world and hope they will find a type of secular love with each other that compensates for those blessings they have forsaken. However, I have never, in all of my time as keeper, heard of even one instance where a man was unfaithful to his wife.
So those who do wait until the marriage is sanctioned, they never stray, ever?
This was what she needed to know.
The promise of Zaccarias is such that it becomes impossible to feel desire for another woman once a man gives his soul into the keeping of his Kaylee. You could, if you were so inclined, strip naked and openly attempt to seduce me, but nothing you did could entice me to desire you.
He meant it. He did not believe he could be tempted by another woman.
What about if your wife died? Would you be able to have another wife?
His expression was solemn.
No man can live without his soul. One of the great trade-offs the men of Estolia make in embracing the faith is the way they become tied to the woman who keeps their soul. Some women who lose their spouse will live on. Often it depends on how much they are needed in this world. Typically, a man and his spouse pass away within a week of one another.
He leaned forward to grasp her hands. It felt like he was communicating through his body language more than voice, his touch itself transmitting information.
When a man's Kaylee, the keeper of his soul, passes on, then he will die within 1 week. He has time enough to finalize any of the loose ends of his life, but no man can survive without her. The joy we experience in life makes this a sacrifice we are willing to make.
I guess that means Nico really does need to be sure I'm the right one for him.
Kenzie said. Physical pain blasted through her system as she faced the possibility that he might reevaluate and choose someone else.
No, my dear, it is not that simple.
He frowned slightly before explaining.
Once a man is gifted to see the aura of his future mate, his future is sealed. Nico has 2 futures available to him at this point. Only 2 choices. He will do everything in his power to convince you to consummate your union, preferably on the day of his 30th birthday. and then marry you after.
His eyes grew shadowed as he continued.
If you are not sure, he does have a full year until he turns 31 to try to convince you.
One of his choices is to marry me, either sooner or later, so long as he is 30 when the marriage takes place.
She asked.
Correct.
He smiled with a look of fond reminiscence.
Once he marries 7 days later, the spirit is consulted. And if the marriage is sanctioned by the spirit, then you are tied together until time ceases to be. This is merely a formality so long as the union is sanctioned beforehand. For the first consul, he is made keeper on the 8th day after his marriage, a very solemn and sacred ceremony.
And if he doesn't marry me, you select his bride for him?
Kenzie guessed. Zeke lost some of his color.
No, Kenzie, that is not what would happen.
He stood up and walked away from where she was sitting, going to look in the vanity mirror. He had a dark frown on his face. Turning, he walked swiftly back to her, pulling her to her feet, holding both of her hands, his eyes meeting hers.
I fear for Estolia, even for the planet itself, if you do not choose to marry my nephew. It is not typical for the king to have 3 sons. Nico has an older and a younger brother, and there was a prophecy made about all 3. The fate of our entire world is dependent on your choosing to take Nico's soul into your keeping. It was prophesied that the 3 sons of Lylane would be the future king, the future keeper, and a catalyst of change for planet Earth. Nico's younger brother, Zeb, must be allowed to fulfill his destiny.
I don't understand.
Kenzie said.
If the keeping of the soul is linked to virginity, can't Nico find another woman?
No, Kenzie. Once he saw your aura, he had no more choice.
She studied his expression. Despite his deep alarm at the thought of her rejecting Nico, he did not believe she would reject him. Feeling self-conscious at the way this man could so easily see into her soul, she asked.
Is there no room for love in this religion?
Kenzie, I can see you will be a delightful addition to our family. To answer your question, yes, love is a part of our religion. In the secular, non-Estolian world, the viewing of the aura is akin to love at first sight. When Nico saw you and your aura, he fell in love with you, as you, I think, fell in love with him.
Has anyone ever rejected the woman whose aura they saw?
She asked. His face grew serious again.
My aunt Anastasia fell in love with a university professor who was visiting here in Estolia. He had no religious background, and he was disturbed by what little she told him. She was young and impetuous, with a tempestuous nature. When he did not accept her the instant she shared the nuances of the Estolian faith, they argued. She rode back to the palace, but her horse spooked, and she was thrown. She broke her neck and died instantly. Eduardo was devastated. He never had another woman in his life. He remained a good friend of the family. His loss was felt by all who knew him.
She looked down to where her hands were still clasped in his. All the Estolian men she met seemed to feel things acutely.
It is strange that so much of your religion is centered around the actions of the men. I haven't heard much referencing the obligations of the women.
He chuckled, squeezing her hands before leading her to sit back down.
Women who are daughters of Estolia, those who embrace both the faith, and more importantly, those who take the soul of an Estolian into their safekeeping, are considered to have all the attributes of godliness. They do not need to do more than guide their spouse on the road of life. The rewards are impossible to enumerate. As a unit, a man and his Kaylee have great promise as to their eternal nature. The essence is felt here in this life. The details of what it is like in the life after this life, in Torreson, are not given to us to know. As a people, and as a religion, we are simple.
They were both silent for some time. Zeke finally stood and bowed at the waist.
I believe that is enough information for now. Please know I am always available to you. You might also wish to speak with Nico's father or his brother Leon. None of us doubted you were the woman destined to keep his soul.
He pulled her into his arms for a hug, and then left while she was still mulling his words over. Chapter 9. Chat with Lilane.
Estolians are a simple people, their religion not at all complex, but the blessings are uniformly great for those who heed the message deity speaks to their hearts. Fourth postulate of inner peace. Kaidaro.
Over the course of the week, Kenzie spent time with many of the individuals in the palace. She knew she would marry Nico, yet there was something that held her back from agreeing outright. They were relaxing in one of the elaborate sitting rooms. The queen, Callista, played softly on the piano, while conversation drifted from subject to subject. Nico sat next to Kenzie.
The day after tomorrow, I turn 30.
I know.
Are you willing to watch the dawn with me tomorrow morning?
Nico asked.
It is tradition that, if possible, the men of Estolia climb Mount Estoliana to watch the sunrise on the last day we are 29.
I will come with you.
Zeb volunteered. He grinned, knowing that this would make him an unwanted third. Zeke responded.
I believe it would be ideal if Zeb did come with the two of you.
Perhaps when you have finished, the two of us could have a chat?
Lilane, the former queen of Estolia, suggested. Circumstances were starting to build a momentum of their own. The ride to the top of Mount Estoliana was emotionally and spiritually moving. It was very dark when they began their ride, but the horses seemed to know the pathway. Since she did not know how to ride, Kenzie rode double with Nico to the top of the mountain. She worried about the burden on the horse, but was reassured that Aristotle, Nico's stallion, was extremely powerful, and the distance was not great. The time spent with her back pressed to Nico's front, his arms around her waist, was a sensory banquet. The warmth of his body pressed up against her contrasted with the cool air against her face. The heady aroma of mayberry blossoms and the fresh scent of the world waking was accented by the combined scent of both Nico and Aristotle. As they neared the summit, she became aware of the heat of his desire pressed against her. The gait of the stallion seemed to match the surging waves of desire pulsing through her core. The sunrise did not disappoint. The rising sun came up behind Mount Zaccarias, throwing the turrets of the palace into bold relief for several moments before the sun peeked over the edge of the central pyramid, and suddenly it was transformed, like a black and white photograph turned to color. Later that morning, she was invited to the private sitting room of the former king and queen. She and Lilane, as she insisted on being addressed, enjoyed a cup of mayberry blossom tea together.
I've heard that you are torn in making your decision. I felt I might be able to clear up at least one or two things that might be bothering you.
Lilane spoke with an American accent.
You're very kind.
No, Kenzie, I'm not kind. I'm a mother, and I desperately want my son to be happy. I know you, and only you can bring Nico happiness.
Her voice grew gentle, and she asked,
What barrier stands in your way, Kenzie?
I want to believe,
she said.
I just don't think it's nearly as good as they make it sound. It's too good to be true. Men are men. How can they be faithful to one woman for life? I mean to say.
She paused to gather her thoughts before continuing.
I know some men can be faithful to a single woman for life, but every member of the faith? That just sounds like a fantasy to me.
Lilane smiled in comprehension.
I've lived here in Estolia for 33 years. I've never seen any man stray who has given his soul into the keeping of his wife.
She grinned at Kenzie before adding,
They don't even have a word for adultery in the Estolian language.
Don't you feel like women are sort of superfluous in the Estolian faith? Almost as if there was no reason for them to be a part of it?
No, it is not like that at all. Think how it was more than 2,700 years ago. Life could be brutally short for a woman. Here comes this faith that gives women unheard of reassurances. It's common for a man to see his oldest grandson wed. The way things are done here, that means the man has lived to be 93 or close to it. Women in this faith get longevity, a spouse who cannot cheat, and they share something immeasurable. You cannot know how it feels to take your husband's soul into your keeping. The connection is intimate, exquisite, extraordinary. There is no way I could explain it. though many women have tried.
She paused to sip her tea before expanding.
The men of Estolia have their capitulos, the novella that tells everything about the life of each king. They spend a year of education, sometime between the age of 18 and 30, learning about the lives of each former king. Women may read the capitulos if they wish. They're frankly erotic. The women have their ensayos, where they take the time to share their thoughts.
It seems to me that most of the time the selection of a man's bride must be easy. Why is it so hard for me, for Nico?
Easy?
Lilane laughed.
My dear, I'll tell you someday just how easy our union wasn't. Or you can read my ensayo. No, my husband decided to reject me and was on the verge of requesting that his brother exercise the office of last resort when he was reminded of something and realized I was right for him and for the nation. No, it is not always easy.
Kenzie felt no nearer deciding.
I believe I know, Kenzie O'Rourke, what will help you to decide. And the beauty of it all is that it's quite easy to do.
What must I do?
Tonight, at the small party we are having, dance with my son. Give him all your attention. Let him convince you that you are the very center of his universe. I think you've spoken with everyone, but the one person most qualified to help you really make this decision. You need to speak with him. I think you'll feel like you've discovered a clarity of thought that has been missing up until now.
Chapter 10. Fountain.
The longevity of Estolia can be directly attributed to the strength of the promised blessings. No Estolian man, having yielded his soul up into the keeping of his spouse, can do so without experiencing the compulsion to raise each child steeped in the teachings of Zaccarias, so that they too will have the same wondrous experience in their time. Francisco Feliciano Zaccarian, Capítulo 77.
Kenzie was dressed for the evening celebrations early. It was about an hour before the evening meal. She left her room and left the palace to stand by the fountain and gaze at Mount Estoliana. She frequently looked at both the cathedral and the entrance to the temple. She sat on the side of the fountain nearest the valley between the mountains. It provided her an uninterrupted view of the two holy buildings. She had been fascinated by both since she came to Estolia.
There comes a time when you do have to make a leap of faith,
said a firm voice behind her. She turned. It was Nico's brother Leon, the king of Estolia.
Why is it hard for me?
She asked him.
My guess is that you have grown up in the absence of any guiding faith or religion. You are not comfortable yielding yourself up to deity in any form, and probably you have felt a certain level of contempt for those who have a belief based on something so ephemeral as faith.
She felt as if somehow this man, whose job description was not about matters of the spirit, understood her better than Zeke did.
If you yield yourself up to faith, it feels like you are rejecting a love and belief in science and the scientific method. It is hard to accept that there can be a deity who can influence your life.
How could some deity know her, choose her as the one for Nico?
Tell me, Kenzie, if you were to remove religion from the equation, would you be more or less tempted to marry Nico?
Her response was immediate.
More.
You would marry him if the faith was not a part of this.
Leon asserted.
It is the religion itself standing in the way. It gives promises you are not willing to believe because you worry you will discover that they are not true. You worry you will be promised Nico is yours for eternity, only to find he has strayed, and you were a fool to believe this silly religion and the assertions within it. You do not want to believe if believing makes you a fool. You feel strongly that the promises are too clear, too specific, not nearly as vague as Christian religions you may have learned about.
You understand me better than I understand myself.
Moved by the Spirit to reassure you, help you to see a few things clearly from a new perspective. I believe there are strong forces at work here in Estolia.
He was silent for a short while.
I could take you to visit every family in Estolia. Every family. You would find a sort of universal happiness in marriage. I believe it is because the promises of deity are kept, that there is so much faith in our religion. We believe because we are given proof that there is a reason to believe.
Her eyes returned to the temple. Nico knew what his purpose in life was. What would her purpose be?
If you would marry Nico in the absence of his faith, you should marry him in its presence. I ask you, Kenzie, as sovereign of Estolia, and as Nico's brother, to exercise faith in only one thing, yourself. You are right for my brother. Have faith that you can hold him. Trust in yourself.
He pulled her into his arms and hugged her.
Save at least one dance for me tonight.
After he left, she turned her back on the temple and looked instead at the pond. Immense koi swam lazily in the water. She sat on the edge and trailed her fingers in the water, watching as one gold and red fish surfaced and tried to swallow one of her fingers. She giggled at the sensation. In front of her was the palace spread out in all its wondrous glory. Suddenly she felt carefree, as if her soul was a hot air balloon and all the ballast was jettisoned. She was not sure, not entirely, how the evening would go, but she sensed everything was coming clear to her. She was glad that the waiting was almost over. Hands crept around her waist. Kenzie knew instinctively that they belonged to Nico, and she leaned backwards against the strong bulk of his body. The memory of the erotic dreams warming her nights came back to her, as his body pressed against hers. She put her hands over his and sighed.
It is just about time for dinner,
he said after a couple of minutes. She nodded, and when he stepped away, she turned and looked at him. He was the most attractive man she had ever met. She remembered back, was it only a week ago? To when he proposed to her. After Mark's brutal denunciation of her, it seemed impossible to believe anyone would find her attractive. His eyes met hers, studied them, perhaps trying to decipher the message within. Whatever he saw spurred him to step closer and take her into his arms. She returned his kiss passionately, wanting to do nothing more than skip the celebration and explore everything this man had to give to her, for as long as he could. She felt the hot prod of his desire just before he pulled back, easing his body away from hers, and smiling.
Kenzie, I would love to have you for my wife. What I do not want is for you to answer right now. Let us enjoy the festivities.
Chapter 11. A Perfect Fit.
The daughters of Estolia are the glue that holds Estolia together, the strength running through the history of the nation. Their role is often overlooked. From Zaccarias onwards, not one Estolian man could have succeeded in the many mighty feats that permeate our past without a woman to keep his soul and bring order to his nights. Miracle Zaccarian, the women of the project.
The meal was convivial. The family was as pleasant as ever. They all used English, for which she was grateful. She had already picked up some of the Estolian language, but it would be a while before she would be fully comfortable with it. After the meal, Nico escorted her to the ballroom, and they were the first on the dance floor, dancing to a chamber orchestra set up to one side of the ballroom. The evening was magical, with beautiful music and the sense of an occasion. She learned over the course of the evening that it was typical in Estolia to have celebrations on the day before, rather than the day of the birthday. It was the aim of every Estolian man to spend his 30th birthday alone with his future wife. She danced with each of the men, Nico's father and uncle, his older and younger brothers, his sister, Ria's new husband, and his cousin, Max. But most of the dances she spent in Nico's arms, reveling in how matched their bodies were. During one long slow song, Nico said to her,
I think I never really took much notice of where you were coming from emotionally when I met you.
I had a lucky escape,
she said.
That you characterize it as an escape tells me there is trauma involved. No matter how lucky you were to escape, and especially no matter how lucky I was to have you free, it cannot be easy to wear a man's ring and then have him call it off. You told me he called you a fat circus freak.
She did not want to think about what Mark called her, which meant his words still had the power to wound. Nico stopped dancing and pulled her closely into his arms, hugging her tightly. The other dancers swirled around them, leaving them like an island in the middle of the dance floor. She reveled in the feeling of his strong arms around her, holding her tight, making her feel as if she was precious and protected. The feel of his body against her own set her heart to hammering. He pulled back slightly so he could cup the side of her face before tilting her chin up slightly.
I need to tell you what I see in you, what you are to me.
His eyes searched hers.
You don't really have to.
Mark had extolled her virtues frequently enough in the beginning, until he met Sheila.
One of the greatest delights I have, Kenzie, is how close you are in height to me. I do not wish a wife who is so small I worry about breaking her when I make love to her. So short I suffer from backache just because I like kissing her. From our very first kiss, I have marveled at how perfectly you were constructed to be the correct height for me, and hopefully you feel the same, that I am the correct height for you. We are so well matched.
She did not expect him to comment on her height.
In fact, I believe you wear your height better than any other woman I have ever known of a similar height. Most tall women hunch over, or they fail to show off their glorious long legs. I have been falling asleep at night thinking about your legs and how they will feel wrapped around me.
It was her turn to blush. She had the same fantasy, dreaming of her legs wrapped possessively around his hips, his torso, his thighs, holding him tight while his body claimed hers, and she claimed him. He laughed, and she liked how carefree he sounded.
We are making a spectacle of ourselves. We should sit so we can continue this fascinating conversation. Kenzie, I want you to know how I see you. You are not required to reciprocate. I just feel a deep compulsion to share with you what has been with me since I met you.
Leon and Callista interrupted them.
We brought you a bottle of the Danieli vintage,
he said.
We thought you would enjoy it while you're chatting.
He and Callista moved a small end table closer to them, so they could place an ice bucket on it to keep the wine cooled. Once the wine was poured, the king and queen of Estolia melted away again. Nico handed Kenzie a glass of the wine, cautioning her.
This is incredibly potent wine, so be careful.
She took the wine from him, marveling afresh at his thoughtfulness. She learned that occasionally an Estolian seduced his wife-to-be to tie her to him. But regardless of what was typical, Nico was set on winning her over rather than simply storming her defenses. His comment about the wine proved his intentions. He would not get her drunk to achieve his aims.
Do you know if your eye color is genetic?
Nico asked her.
Because I am really hoping it is. I think the one thing that fascinated me the most when I first looked into your eyes was how your hair color seemed merely an extension of the rainbow you were born with.
It is genetic. My father, grandfather, and aunt all had one blue eye and one green eye. It's entirely possible we'll have at least one child with two different colored eyes.
I shall cherish all our children, but those with different colored eyes will hold a special part of my heart.
She sipped the wine. His words were like a healing salve applied to the wounds Mark inflicted upon her soul.
Zeke believes the times we are moving into are very difficult, even for those of us blessed to live in Estolia. When Zeb marries, he will be a catalyst of global change. Because of the prophecy, it is important that both the keeper and his wife are individuals with strong personalities and depth of character. Zeke states it is critical to the success of Zeb's mission that I have chosen a woman who has a strong character.
What will Zeb do?
It is not known. He went to Harvard at 16 and has been living separate from Estolia since he concluded his acolyte year just after getting his degree in international business. In fact, he attended Harvard at the same time as Leon, Max, Darren, and I. He is brilliant. In 5 years, he took a legacy from our mother, Lelaine, and has multiplied it more than 100 times. Zeke believes at least one part of the prophecy might relate to the power that comes from an obscene level of wealth. We may never know in this life exactly how Zeb will influence the minds and hearts of world leaders.
He's been here since I arrived.
She noted.
I thought he lived here.
Not to alarm you, but he returned home for my wedding. He does not plan to return again until after he himself marries at the age of 30.
After he marries? I didn't think Estolians married away from the island.
It would be impossible for every Estolian to marry here in Estolia. There are Estolians all over the world. In Spain, California, and British Columbia, there are designates who have been granted spiritual leadership of those communities. If possible, every couple sanctioned by the designate will visit Estolia to receive sanction from the keeper of the soul of Estolia. In Zeb's case, he has a most peculiar blessing.
Zeke mentioned something about it.
Yes.
He looked away from her, seeing something in his mind's eye.
When our mother first came to Estolia, the keeper gave her a blessing. In it, she was told that she would have 3 sons, one to be king, one to be keeper, and a 3rd son to be a catalyst of change.
Nico looked around the ballroom until he spotted his mother and he smiled at her.
Zeb's blessings, his Bendenacera when he was 7 days old, and his Bendelora when he was 18, provided further clarification. In both blessings, he was told that he would not be gifted with the aura of his future wife, that he would have to forgo the greatest blessings of Zaccarias so he might fulfill his destiny. He was told he would marry at 30, but he would not meet his wife prior to the hour of their wedding.
That must be hard for him to deal with.
Kenzie observed.
It is hard to deal with, but I hope he will not miss what he has never experienced. He will not really know what he has given up. Therefore, it will not be as painful as it might otherwise be.
Nico did not look satisfied with what he said. He looked mournful, as if he could imagine how empty his brother's life would be compared with his own life and their older male relatives.
It sounds like he'll need a lot of support from us when the time comes for him to marry.
Kenzie's voice was gentle. Her heart went out to Zeb. She liked him. He was a somber, serious sort of person, rarely smiling.
Yes, Kenzie, he will need every bit of help we can give him. Here in Estolia, we believe that those whose burdens are greatest also have the greatest blessings to offset and balance it all out.
It occurred to her that she was, once again, blithely speaking with Nico as if they would be a married couple trying to comfort his youngest brother at some point in the future. Chapter 12, Keeping the Soul.
When you become the keeper, you will come to understand that your Kaylee, the woman who keeps your soul, is, and always shall be, the most critical, pivotal, and significant person in Estolia. Blessing given to Lazarus Ezekiel Zaccarian.
She had to choose what she was going to do, and it felt as impossible now as it was the moment Nico the stranger proposed to her. She knew beyond doubting that she could not reject him. Her heart would break if she left him, and yet, she was not sure she could accept him. His brother urged her to have faith in herself above all other things, but that did not change the internal argument raging within her.
What will I do?
She blurted out. He got to his feet and pulled her slowly into his arms.
As the Kaylee of the keeper, yours is truly the position of greatest importance. I cannot keep the soul of Estolia if my own soul is not safely in your keeping.
It's not that I don't think you have a critical role to fill, but I just feel like I'll be an unimportant cog in the machinery of Estolia. Perhaps it's selfish, but I want to matter, Nico. I want to do more than just be some awesome support to help you be great.
I cannot explain how it works. I believe you will discover that your role will be much more than you anticipate. Perhaps, Kenzie, you need to understand how much faith I have in you.
Your brother told me the only faith I really needed was in myself.
She moved towards him, her body in contact with his, her arms going around his waist.
Perhaps the time for convincing me with words is past, Nico.
He dipped his head down to kiss her. When he pulled away, he looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight. He picked up the bottle of Daniele wine and topped off both of their glasses. Handing her glass to her, he picked up his own before grasping her hand in his and giving it a squeeze before leading her away from the ballroom. Soon they were in a part of the palace she had never visited.
This wing is set aside for my tenure as keeper,
he explained.
It is my home. I eat most often with the family, but sometimes I feel like a quiet night at home.
She looked around curiously as he led her through the different rooms. This was her future home. She looked at Nico, realizing she was alone with him for the first time since they met. Every angle and plane of his face was known to her. She had memorized his features, his accent, his dimples, his beautiful eyes. Everything about him was etched in her memory. The true barrier keeping her from fully agreeing to be with him suddenly occurred to her. She had fallen in love with this handsome man. She wanted him, and more than that, she wanted him to love her. She did not want their union to be demanded by tradition, or religion, or peculiar rules. She wanted the only reason for him to be with her, to marry her, was because he loved her to the exclusion of every other woman he had ever known. She needed to matter to him as much as he mattered to her.
What is it, Kenzie?
She could no longer suppress her feelings.
I love you, Nico. I need you to love me the same.
He took the wine glass from her and set it carefully on the desk next to him. Taking both her hands in his, he squeezed them and said to her, his voice thick with emotion.
Kenzie O'Rourke, I have been in love with you from the moment I first saw you. I was terrified my heart would break. How was it possible that a woman so sophisticated and extraordinary could be chaste? How could my heart be involved with a woman who would not fit in Estolia? How could deity let me down by allowing my heart to be stolen? But then, on the tail end of those thoughts, Kenzie, I recognized your extraordinary beauty was enhanced by the glow of an aura. I was frightened then that you would somehow, some way, not only steal my heart, but also prove my faith was misplaced. How could a woman as wonderful as you, from your society, be pure? I was jealous, deeply jealous of all the men who knew you intimately and who had stolen you from my great need. I could not believe everything going through my heart and soul in the short time between first seeing you and actually speaking with you.
She could tell that he meant everything he was saying.
You asked if I was untouched?
She reminded him.
My heart was in my throat when I prepared to ask you that question. I knew in that moment if you were not chaste, not pure, I would never be able to fulfill my destiny and remain the keeper. If you had known one or more men, I was going to forego the deepest, most intense spiritual connection that exists for men of Estolia. I would not seek another woman. I would do everything I could to win you. I fell in love with you, Kenzie, and I would leave my nation and my faith if that was what was necessary to remain with you.
As we twirl in the magic of the cosmic light. Our secret small space, we're entwined in our world.
Chapter 13. Love.
The 7 deities of Centrath were always referred to, collectively, as a unit. None were considered above or better than the others, and perhaps more importantly, none were lesser deities. The bedrock principle of the faith was the need to consider each of the deities to be of equal importance. Ancient art depicted them in a circle, evenly spaced, or in a semicircle. Ultimately, for ease of expression and for the ability to fluently share the faith with new converts, children, and the interested. The 7 deities were given names to distinguish them. It never seemed to strike the adherents to the faith that it was unusual to believe in 7 deities and their attendant faiths, especially when many claimed to be the one true God. That fact was always conveniently overlooked, or, according to some writings, that was one of the guiding principles. Somi, one of the Septinatro of Palmyra, addressed the perpetual battle between chaos and good. Despite the victory of the 7 deities over chaos, there is no guarantee that the forces of chaos might not recover, return, and destroy all that the 7 deities had created. Because of this, each individual must see themselves as being a participant in the perpetual struggle against the powers of chaos and in favour of the logic and order of the 7 deities. Once committed to battle chaos, the 7 deities rewarded the faithful with all that they might need. Milton Peru, Biblical Influences on Middle-earth Linguistics.
While they were talking, Nico was guiding her out of the library. He paused to kiss her briefly before he turned and led her rapidly to a set of double doors. Once through them, he turned to look at her.
As a rule, men in my country tend to be very romantic. focused in on the sensation of giving our soul into the keeping of our mate.
He smiled one of his quirky dimple-enhanced smiles.
Part of the Acolyte year, we spend time discussing the romantic turn of phrase the most erotic capitulos use. We discuss how to express ourselves best when we experience the extraordinary moment when our soul leaves our body and takes up residence in the sweet embrace of the wonderful soul of our Kaylee.
Kenzie began to unbutton the shirt he was wearing while he spoke.
My brother said that the capitulos did not really help. He said that I must experience it to be able to discuss it and appreciate descriptions of that moment written by our ancestors.
He brushed her hair away from her face, cupping both sides and staring into her eyes.
I realized how true that was when I met you. My heart was so fully involved, I knew in a moment that there would never be a woman I would be able to love other than you. No way for any other woman to rouse me.
You really love me, Nico?
She asked. She slipped her hand under the shirt, touching his hair-roughened chest.
Kenzie, your sweet self has taken hold of me completely, heart and soul. I know the exchange has not yet taken place, but I feel as if you have already taken my soul into your keeping, as if our connection to one another is already indelible and unbreakable. I do not know if I could survive if you rejected me.
She pushed his shirt off his shoulders and leaned towards him, bending her head to taste the warm, salty skin of his neck. His unique scent filled her senses. He tugged at the ball gown's zipper, dragging it down her back with one steady, sure motion, and then pushed it off her shoulders to pool in a brightly colored puddle at her feet. She dropped her hands from his chest to the belt holding his pants up. She unfastened both belt and zipper before pushing his pants down over his hips. He bent down and slipped his shoes and socks off, stepping out of them. When he straightened, he surprised Kenzie by sweeping her up into his arms. She met his eyes with an uncertain expression. He smiled at her as he crossed the room to the large bed, laying her gently down on the soft surface.
I love you, Kenzie. You matter more to me than anything else, more than my family, my religion, my nation.
He climbed onto the bed next to her, covering her mouth with his, escalating from small nibbling to deeply passionate kisses. While he kissed her, he began to caress her breasts through the fabric of her camisole. Her hands explored his chest, his shoulders, his stomach, and encountered the fabric of his underpants. He tugged her camisole upwards until she sat up and helped him to remove it, and her bra. Only her silk and lace briefs remained. His eyes met hers for several heartbeats before his gaze dropped and took in the sight of her unconfined breasts. He leaned towards her and saluted both with mouth and hands. His touch felt like he was throwing kindling on a small fire, encouraging it to roar into blazing life, the fire of her desire. She had admired his firm buttocks many times over the last week, and enjoyed the freedom to caress them now. She mewled in pleasure as he teased and tormented her nipples. She slipped one hand under the waistband of his briefs, caressing the skin and rounded contours of his rear. Soon her second hand joined the first. She pushed his last item of clothing down his legs. After a moment, he paused in what he was doing to finish removing his briefs, dropping them on the floor. When he returned to her, his lips were on hers, one hand on her breast. She caressed his silky skin, tracing the contours of his aroused flesh, enjoying the contrasting textures of crinkly hair, hot taut and loose, cool skin. He mimicked her explorations, his hands first delving under her briefs to caress and cup her rear, before he pushed them down her legs. When he dropped them on the floor and returned to her, they were both completely naked. They explored one another, his hand trailing down her torso to her hips, while she continued her tactile adventure of discovery.
Nico.
She said his name, her hands going from his shoulders to his rear end. She was going crazy, needing, wanting his possession. In that one word, she knew he could hear the last of her uncertainties melting away. This was what she wanted, what she needed.
Kenzie.
He repeated her name, his eyes meeting hers. Somewhere in the palace, a clock started to chime as Nico's body surged forward, crying out with her as they both experienced a momentary disorientation followed by pleasure. Chapter 14, Ultimate Connection.
One aspect of the exchange is the way it facilitates communication between two spouses. Many individuals in the Western world marry for the wrong reasons, often at a time that is not optimal for marital happiness and growth. Few relationships can withstand this handicap. Even couples that marry for all the right reasons, with an abiding true love, can still find themselves teetering on the verge of dissolution if they allow miscommunication to flourish and grow as an obstacle to their happiness. The profound wisdom of deity in granting Estolians a near telepathic connection via the keeping of the soul eliminates nearly all of the difficulties that can sour a marriage. It would, of course, be simplistic to say that every marriage is free of discord, but the destructive, acidic deterioration of marriages common to other nations doesn't exist in Estolia. Dominic Zaccarian, Essay on Love.
Estolia was a wondrous land more marvelous than the most extraordinary fairy tale. She and Nico fit perfectly together, their hearts melded, their minds met, and their souls fused. The cries that burst from both were harmonious, synchronized, bursting from both, accompanying the waves of pleasure pulsing through them. Deity brought them together, helped their souls merge, two parts to a whole that always belonged together. For a moment she had a vision of the future, his warm eyes still sharp, clear, lively and intelligent, surrounded by the wrinkles and marks of age. He pulled her close against him, pillowing her head on his chest. The sound of his heart augmented her vision of the future, and she imagined how it would feel to fall asleep with the sound of his heartbeat in her ear, every night for a lifetime. Happiness and peace flooded her soul.
I love you, Kenzie, with every particle of my soul, every ounce of my body, every iota of the self within me.
He warned her.
We will be visited by my brother, my father, and my uncle.
Their clothing was scattered on the floor. With a feeling of freedom, she slipped out of the bed, naked, and began picking up the clothing.
Lift your arms,
he whispered behind her. She did so, and he settled a beautiful nightgown over her. She smoothed it into place and then turned to look at him. He was wearing a bathrobe. Somewhere in the palace, the same clock began to chime the half hour. The chimes were still echoing when a knock on the door was followed by it opening. Zeke, Leon, and Isaiah all came into the room. While they approached, Nico pulled Kenzie back against his body, his hands splayed over her abdomen.
What say you, Nicodemus Luciano Zaccarian?
Zeke asked. His expression was solemn.
Kenzie O'Rourke has taken my soul securely within her keeping,
Nico stated. Zeke stepped closer, his eyes meeting Kenzie's.
My nephew claims he has taken your purity, and as a result, he has placed his soul securely within your keeping. What say you, Kenzie O'Rourke?
In exchange for my purity, I have taken Nico's soul into my keeping.
The words just seemed to come to her. Zeke smiled at her, and she sensed how pleased he was.
I believe it is in your best interest to go now, tonight, to the seclusion suite.
She shrugged into a robe like Nico's, and Zeke led them towards the end of a long hallway.
When my grandfather shattered both of his legs,
he explained as they went along,
his brother, the king, had our smallest tower converted into a combination elevator, library, and staircase. Very little work was necessary. This will take us to the stable level and cuts the journey to the temple almost in half, since the stable level is halfway down the side of the mountain.
Kenzie only barely heard what Zeke was sharing with her. She felt like everything she was seeing and feeling was done for the first time, as if there was a close connection between Nico and herself, growing in strength and durability. What mattered was that she was with Nico now, and would be with him for their entire lives, until time ceased to be. Chapter 15. Manipulation.
The field of spherical shapes stretches into the distance. I often walk among them, stroking their metal flanks, and on occasion I check in to see how the abandoned projects were progressing. About 1/3 of the spheres were locked in the hellscape of uncontrolled climate change, while others were frozen deep in the thrall of an ice age. Some few, however, were tenaciously doing their best to overcome the adversity of near extinction and were finding uniquely creative ways to make the best of what they had left. About 1 in 10 were rocky wastelands with only the simplest of biological life fighting for survival against near insurmountable odds. While some had proposed that a new field of spheres could sprout up on the far side of the Ngaio River, I doubt that we shall ever embrace another iteration. The newest citizens working on the grand design do not know just how finite are the resources remaining to us. Kailaria believes that Elora will crack the code, solve the unsolvable, and provide us with, if nothing else, the closure some of us need. It was folly and hubris to believe this pathway would lead anywhere. Krynos, Musings on Eternity.
The cesspool of human thought, and the sewer of their motives were the main constants upon which Herschel could rely. He had only to provide sufficient reward, and he could achieve more than any of his peers. He rubbed the spot on his arm that she had touched. He closed his eyes and shuddered as he recalled her gentle, healing gesture. He imagined her touching him in the same way, circling his flesh with hers, subservient to the needs of his body. His pleasant fantasy was shattered by the ringing of a bell as the door to the small bookshop opened and then closed. The man who entered the shop had Mayan ancestry, underdeveloped chin and jaw, large aquiline nose, sloping forehead, slender ears with pendulous lobes, receding hairline and thinning brown hair, black eyes, and this man had a flattened nose and larger lips indicating Negroid influence. He looked around the empty shop, looking in all directions before he saw Herschel sitting in one of the armchairs. He slid into the other armchair and then sniffled, wiping his leaking nose with the back of one hand. Beady eyes glanced suspiciously to the right and left before focusing on him again.
I got a message,
he said, sniffling and wiping his nose again, before settling his hands on his knees. His fingers were supple, disproportionately long for a short man, and they convulsively gripped and released the knobby knees. Another darting look around the small shop preceded the man's next disjointed sentence.
that it would be worth my while to see you.
Herschel quirked a brow at the man, waiting to see what he would do or say next. The spidery fingers gripped the knees hard before each digit relaxed.
I mean to say, I heard it would be worth my while to meet someone. I was told to ask for Hershey.
The nose twitched, an impressive feat for so much nasal real estate packed into a single face.
But see, I'm allergic to chocolate.
The name is Herschel.
Herschel? Hershey? Same thing.
His hands retreated from his knees, wiping against the grimy material. Herschel was already tired of interacting with the man. He nudged a thick manila envelope with one foot. It was sealed, with a smaller envelope on top.
Take these envelopes,
he commanded. The man picked them up. His eyes grew wide when he noted that one of them contained a thick wad of green bills.
The money is yours if you take the other envelope to the destination I specify.
Slender fingers rifled through the contents. Herschel felt the warmth of satisfaction. This man would do his bidding. He forgot how enjoyable it was to be deity. He focused his attention on the man. Armendori was his name. Darius for short. Soon, yes, soon he would have that sort of blind devotion again. For now, however, he would begin with this man. "18 months later, his plot began to come together. Darius had matured significantly. He was no longer the half-stoned addict that Herschel originally met. While his appearance and features were no less difficult to behold, he had at least shaken off his addiction, and as a courier, with consistent housing and nourishment, he had become more confident and self-assured. Since his first encounter with Darius, Herschel's greatest achievement was teaching the man to be receptive enough to do his bidding at the slightest nudge. His attention sharpened on the scene playing out before him. Darius was speaking with a nondescript man, average height and weight, with red hair and a receding hairline. His hair was turning silver white at the temples. Deep lines of pain furrowed his brow. Darius was secretly drugging him, making him receptive to suggestions. Herschel chuckled silently to himself. He and Paldea had both denounced Alora's constant coddling of her subjects as being unworthy and without value. Who cared what they thought? Yet here he was, doing the exact same thing. In his defense, providing Marsden Taylor Smythe the emotional support he craved made him much easier to work with. Taylor Smythe paused in what he was saying to Darius, his whole body subsumed by the raspy, racking cough. Darius hid a smile, but Herschel could read his mind. He was feeling the triumph of successfully poisoning the older man in a way that would be undetectable. As he grew weaker, he became more susceptible to Darius' suggestions. His daughter, Cassandra, was the most important variable in Alora's grand design. She would fail if they could thwart her role. Herschel reviewed the prospectus. She was to become the counterpart to Alora's catalyst of change, and her superfluous guidelines called for absurd conditions, namely, virginity and availability. All he had to do was make sure she wasn't free to marry, wasn't virginal, and in one simple act, the grand design would be destroyed. Sloane Danvers strode purposely into the room, closing the door forcefully behind him. Marsden looked troubled, his brow knit in a frown, as if he was having second thoughts. Herschel urged Darius to administer another dose of the drug. Once the drugs wore off, he wouldn't know what he had done. The beauty of his plan was that he would use one of the men most complicit in those practices that would wipe away the natural protections against cataclysmic climate change, profiting at the expense of future generations. To have him be the individual who would profit off the death of Alora's dreams was justice so sweet that Herschel felt a shudder of delight no less exquisite than an orgasm.